Chapter 1: A House of Cards. Jim Collins drove down Maplewood Drive, his mind preoccupied with the routine events of the day. As a foreman at Curtis Construction, he had built or framed most of the houses on this street. There was a sense of pride in his work, a tangible legacy in every brick and beam. His boss, David Adams, always joked that Jim had practically built half the town by himself. Jim pulled into his driveway and noticed a familiar SUV parked in front of his house. The license plate read Mark 1. He frowned, puzzled. Mark Lavalier, a rival contractor and occasional friend, was the last person Jim expected to see here, especially without a prior heads-up. His stomach churned with an inexplicable unease. Inside, the house was quiet except for the sound of the television in the living room. "Linda, I am home," Jim called out, hanging his jacket and kicking off his work boots. "Living room," came Linda's reply, her voice strained and unusually high-pitched. Jim entered the living room, expecting to find Linda and Mark discussing some new project or sharing a beer. Instead, he was met with a scene that froze him in his tracks. Linda was sitting uncomfortably on the small couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Mark lounged on the other end, looking far too relaxed. "What's going on here?" Jim asked, his voice barely masking his suspicion. "Jim, there's no easy way to say this," Linda began, avoiding his eyes. "Mark and we've been seeing each other." For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. Jim felt a rush of blood to his head, his vision blurring. He had never imagined this, not in a million years. "What do you mean, seeing each other?" Jim's voice was dangerously calm, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. "It means exactly what you think it means," Mark interjected, his tone smug. Before Jim could respond, their daughter Grace burst into the room, her eyes wide with excitement. "Daddy, Mark is taking us to the lake, and he has a boat!" Jim turned to look at his daughter, her innocence and enthusiasm only amplifying his pain. "Grace, honey, why don't you go play outside for a bit?" he said gently. Grace pouted but complied, sensing the tension. Lucas followed her without a word, his eyes darting nervously between the adults. As soon as the kids were out of earshot, Jim turned back to Linda and Mark. "How long?" he demanded. Linda flinched but held her ground. "A few months," she admitted. "Months?" Jim echoed, his voice rising. "In my house? With my kids?" "Jim, calm down," Linda pleaded. "This isn't good for anyone." "Oh, I am sorry," Jim snapped. "Should I be concerned about your comfort right now?" Mark stood up, trying to assert his presence. "Look, Jim, this isn't about you. Linda and I have feelings for each other." "Feelings?" Jim laughed bitterly. "You think that justifies this betrayal?" Mark moved closer, his expression hardening. "Maybe if you had been a better husband." That was the last straw. Jim's fist connected with Marcus' jaw before he even realized he had moved. Mark stumbled back, clutching his face, eyes wide with shock. "Jim, stop it!" Linda screamed, rushing between them. Jim's breathing was ragged, his fists clenched at his sides. "Get out of my house!" he growled at Mark. "And don't you ever come back!" Mark shot him a venomous look but didn't argue. He grabbed his coat and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Linda turned to Jim, tears streaming down her face. "Jim, I'm sorry. I didn't want it to happen like this." "Like what, Linda?" Jim shouted. "How exactly did you want this to happen? Over a nice dinner, a friendly chat? There's no good way for a husband to find out his wife has been cheating on him." Linda sobbed, covering her face with her hands. Jim wanted to comfort her, but the betrayal cut too deep. Instead, he stormed out of the house, needing to clear his head. He walked aimlessly for what felt like hours, replaying the scene in his mind. How had he missed the signs? The late nights, the sudden disinterest in family activities, the secretive phone calls. He had trusted Linda completely, and now that trust lay shattered at his feet. As dusk settled, Jim found himself at the local park, sitting on a bench overlooking the lake. He watched the sunset, its colors reflecting off the water, and felt a profound sense of loss. His life, once so stable and predictable, had been upended in the blink of an eye. Returning home, he found the house dark and silent. Linda had gone to bed, or perhaps she was crying somewhere. He didn't care. He went to the kitchen, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and sat at the table. The divorce papers Linda had left for him sat in a neat stack. She wanted primary custody of the kids, $500 a month in child support, and half of everything else. Jim laughed bitterly. Of course, he muttered, taking a long swig of his beer. He knew he needed a lawyer, someone who could help him navigate this mess. But for now, all he could do was sit and stare at the life he once knew, now crumbling around him. Tomorrow, he would call David and tell him everything. He needed to start thinking about his future, one that no longer included Linda. The thought was both terrifying and liberating. As he finished his beer and stood to leave the kitchen, he glanced at the family photos on the wall. They seemed to mock him with their frozen smiles and happy memories. With a heavy heart, he turned off the light and headed to bed, wondering how he would ever find the strength to rebuild his shattered life. Chapter 2. The Breaking Point. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the table where Jim sat, nursing his second cup of coffee. His mind was a whirl of conflicting emotions, anger, betrayal, and an aching sadness that seemed to settle in his bones. He hadn't slept much, the events of the previous day replaying in his mind like a broken record. David Adams, his boss and closest friend, was the first to hear about the situation. Jim had called him early, explaining the bare bones of what had happened. David had listened quietly, his voice calm and reassuring, promising to help in any way he could. "Come over to my place," David had said. "We'll figure this out together." Jim arrived at David S. house, a modest but well-kept home on the outskirts of town. David greeted him with a firm handshake and a look of genuine concern. "Jim, I'm sorry you're going through this," David said, leading him into the kitchen where his wife Sarah was preparing breakfast. Sarah made some coffee. "Sit down, have something to eat." Jim nodded gratefully, though he had little appetite. Sarah offered him a sympathetic smile and a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. "Thanks, Sarah," Jim said, trying to muster a smile. As they sat around the table, David leaned forward, his expression serious. "So, what's the plan? Have you thought about how you're going to handle this?" Jim sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, David. I never thought I'd be in this position. I need to find a lawyer, someone who can help me sort through this mess." David nodded. "I know a good lawyer, Alyssa Thompson. She's tough but fair. She'll make sure you get a fair deal." "Thanks, David. I appreciate it." Sarah reached across the table, placing a hand on Jim S. "We are here for you, Jim. Whatever you need." Jim felt a swell of gratitude. "Thank you both. I don't know what I'd do without friends like you." Later that day, Jim called Alyssa Thompson's office and set up an appointment. The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork and meetings. Alyssa was a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a keen mind. She listened carefully as Jim explained the situation, nodding occasionally as she took notes. "We'll start by responding to Linda's petition," Alyssa said. "We'll challenge her demands for primary custody and financial support. Given the circumstances, we might be able to argue for joint custody." Jim nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. "What about the house and my savings?" "We'll fight for your fair share," Alyssa assured him, "but I need you to be prepared. Divorce cases can get messy, especially when emotions are running high." Jim took a deep breath. "I understand. I just want what is best for Grace and Lucas." Alyssa smiled slightly. "That is a good attitude to have. Now let us get to work." Meanwhile, at home, the atmosphere was tense and uncomfortable. Jim and Linda communicated only when necessary, their exchanges terse and filled with underlying hostility. Grace and Lucas sensed the tension, their usual chatter subdued. One evening, as Jim sat in the living room reviewing documents from Alyssa, Linda entered the room. She looked weary, dark circles under her eyes betraying her lack of sleep. "Jim, we need to talk," she said quietly. Jim set the papers aside, bracing himself. "What is it, Linda?" "I know you're angry and you have every right to be," Linda began, her voice trembling. "But we need to think about the kids. They don't deserve to be caught in the middle of this." "I agree," Jim said, his voice steely. "But you're the one who put them in this position, Linda." Tears welled up in Linda's eyes. I'm sorry, Jim. I never meant for things to get this bad. Jim felt a pang of sympathy, but it was quickly overshadowed by his anger. Sorry doesn't fix this, Linda. You made your choices. Now we have to deal with the consequences. Linda nodded, wiping her eyes. I know. I want to find a way to make this as painless as possible for Grace and Lucas. We'll figure something out, Jim said, his tone softening slightly, but it's going to take time. As the days turned into weeks, the legal battle intensified. Jim and Linda attended mediation sessions, their arguments often heated and emotional. Greg Harris, Linda's lawyer, was relentless, pushing for the best possible outcome for his client. During one particularly tense session, Greg argued that Linda should have primary custody, citing her role as the primary caregiver. Linda has always been there for the children, Greg stated. She's the one who takes them to school, helps with their homework, and attends their activities. Jim clenched his fists under the table, fighting to keep his temper in check. I've been there too, he countered. I may work long hours, but I make time for my kids. They need both of us. Alyssa leaned forward, her expression calm but firm. Joint custody is in the best interest of the children. They deserve to have a strong relationship with both parents. The mediator, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, nodded thoughtfully. I agree. Joint custody seems to be the most balanced approach. We need to focus on what's best for Grace and Lucas. Linda glanced at Jim, her eyes filled with regret. I just want them to be happy, she said softly. So do I, Jim replied, meeting her gaze. Despite the contentious legal battle, moments of civility and cooperation emerged. Jim and Linda attended parent-teacher conferences together, put on brave faces for school events, and made an effort to shield Grace and Lucas from the worst of their conflict. One evening, Jim found himself sitting with Lucas on the porch, watching the sunset. The boy had been unusually quiet, his eyes distant. Dad, Lucas said finally, why are you and Mom fighting so much? Jim's heart ached at the question. It is complicated, buddy. Sometimes adults have problems they can fix easily. Are you going to get divorced? Lucas asked, his voice trembling. Jim took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. Yes, Lucas, we are. But that doesn't mean we love you and Grace any less. We are still a family, even if things are changing. Lucas nodded slowly, tears welling up in his eyes. Jim pulled him into a tight hug, wishing he could take away his son's pain. As the weeks passed, the tension between Jim and Linda slowly began to ease. They reached a tentative truce, both determined to prioritize their children's well-being. Jim moved into a small apartment nearby, making sure to spend as much time with Grace and Lucas as possible. One afternoon, as Jim was unpacking boxes in his new place, his phone rang. It was David. Hey, Jim, how are you holding up? David asked. I am managing, Jim replied. Just trying to take things one day at a time. Listen, a bunch of us are getting together this weekend for a barbecue. Thought it might be good for you to get out and see some friendly faces, David said. Jim hesitated for a moment, then smiled. That sounds great. I could use a break. As the weekend approached, Jim found himself looking forward to the gathering. It would be a chance to relax, catch up with friends, and momentarily forget about the turmoil in his personal life. The barbecue was held at Jordan Park, a spacious area with picnic tables, a playground, and plenty of open space for games. Jim arrived early, helping David set up the grill and arrange the food. As more people arrived, Jim felt a sense of normalcy returning. He laughed and chatted with old friends, enjoying the camaraderie. It was a welcome distraction from the stress and heartache that had consumed his life. Later in the afternoon, as the sun began to set, Jim found himself sitting with David, watching the kids play on the playground. Thanks for this, David, Jim said. I needed it. David smiled, clapping him on the shoulder. Anytime, Jim. We are all here for you. As the evening drew to a close, Jim felt a renewed sense of hope. It wouldn't be easy, but he knew he had the support of his friends and the strength to rebuild his life. Chapter 3. Shadows of the Past. Jim Collins sat at his new kitchen table, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows on the walls. The apartment was small, a far cry from the home he had shared with Linda, but it was a fresh start. He took a sip of his coffee, the bitterness mirroring the lingering ache in his heart. His mind drifted back to the early days with Linda, memories that were now tainted by her betrayal. They had met in the most unassuming way. Jim was a fresh-faced young man, just starting out at Curtis Construction, when he first laid eyes on Linda. She was standing in the local auto parts store, muttering to herself as she tried to pick out a battery for her car. "Charts are right here," Jim had said quietly, pointing to the display. Linda had looked up, frustration evident in her eyes. "Uh-huh, but my car's not on there," she had snapped. "And Tweedledum over there is too busy to get off his fat bum." Jim had chuckled, undeterred by her sharp tone. "What kind of car you got?" he asked. Linda had described her car, and Jim had found the battery she needed, even offering to install it for her. They had talked briefly, and he had driven her home, where he met her father, Bud Livingston. Bud had taken an immediate liking to Jim, discovering they shared a love for mechanics and cold beer. "If you're gonna date my daughter, you better save up every penny," Bud had chuckled. "Girl never saw a shiny thing she didn't want." Jim had nodded, his sandy blonde hair catching the afternoon light. He had found Linda's sharp wit and fiery spirit intriguing, and their relationship had blossomed quickly. They had shared many good times, their love growing stronger with each passing year. He remembered their wedding day vividly. Linda had looked radiant, her smile lighting up the room as they exchanged vows. They had been so happy then, so full of hope and dreams for the future. Their first child, Grace, had brought even more joy into their lives. Linda had doted on her, and Jim had felt a deep sense of pride watching his wife transform into a loving mother. But somewhere along the way, things had started to change. Linda's demands grew, her desire for more material possessions becoming insatiable. She had convinced Jim to get a vasectomy after Lucas was born, saying she wanted to focus on her career and their existing family. Jim had reluctantly agreed, wanting to make her happy. Motherhood had curbed some of Linda's demands, but her restlessness remained. Jim had often worked long hours to meet her expectations, and slowly, the distance between them grew. He had missed the signs, the subtle shifts in her behavior, and now he was paying the price. The sound of his phone ringing jolted Jim from his reverie. He glanced at the screen and saw David's name. "Hey, David," Jim said, answering the call. "Hey, Jim, just checking in. How are you holding up?" David's voice was warm, filled with concern. "I am managing," Jim replied, "just taking it one day at a time." "That's all you can do," David said. "Listen, I was thinking we could grab a drink this weekend. What do you say?" Jim smiled, grateful for his friend's unwavering support. "That sounds good. I could use a break." As the weekend approached, Jim found himself looking forward to the outing. It would be a welcome distraction from the turmoil of his personal life. He met David at their favorite bar, a cozy place called the Rusty Nail, known for its laid-back atmosphere and great beer. They found a table in the corner, away from the noise of the crowd. David ordered a couple of beers and they settled in, the familiar surroundings providing a sense of comfort. "So how are things with the kids?" David asked, taking a sip of his beer. Jim sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's tough. Grace and Lucas are trying to understand what is happening, but it's a lot for them to process. I am doing my best to be there for them." David nodded sympathetically. "Kids are resilient. They'll get through this, and they have a great dad who loves them." "Thanks, David," Jim said, his voice tinged with emotion. "I just hope I am doing enough." "You are," David assured him, "and you are not alone. We are all here for you." Jim smiled, the weight on his shoulders feeling a little lighter. They spent the next few hours talking about work, sports, and old times, the conversation flowing easily. It was exactly what Jim needed, a reminder that there was still good in his life, despite everything. The next day, Jim met with Alyssa Thompson to go over the latest developments in the divorce case. She was as sharp and focused as ever, her eyes scanning the documents spread out on the table. "We are making progress," Alyssa said, looking up at Jim. "Linda's lawyer is pushing hard, but we have a strong case for joint custody." Jim nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. "I just want what's best for Grace and Lucas." And we'll fight for that, Alyssa said firmly. But I need you to be prepared. This isn't going to be easy. I know, Jim said. I'm ready for whatever comes. As the weeks turned into months, the legal battle continued. Jim and Linda attended mediation sessions, their arguments often heated and emotional. Greg Harris, Linda's lawyer, was relentless, pushing for the best possible outcome for his client. During one particularly tense session, Greg argued that Linda should have primary custody, citing her role as the primary caregiver. Linda has always been there for the children, Greg stated. She's the one who takes them to school, helps with their homework, and attends their activities. Jim clenched his fists under the table, fighting to keep his temper in check. I've been there too, he countered. I may work long hours, but I make time for my kids. They need both of us. Alyssa leaned forward, her expression calm but firm. Joint custody is in the best interest of the children. They deserve to have a strong relationship with both parents. The mediator, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, nodded thoughtfully. I agree. Joint custody seems to be the most balanced approach. We need to focus on what is best for Grace and Lucas. Linda glanced at Jim, her eyes filled with regret. I just want them to be happy, she said softly. So do I, Jim replied, meeting her gaze. Despite the contentious legal battle, moments of civility and cooperation emerged. Jim and Linda attended parent-teacher conferences together, put on brave faces for school events, and made an effort to shield Grace and Lucas from the worst of their conflict. One evening, Jim found himself sitting with Lucas on the porch, watching the sunset. The boy had been unusually quiet, his eyes distant. Dad, Lucas said finally, why are you and Mom fighting so much? Jim's heart ached at the question. It's complicated, buddy. Sometimes adults have problems they can fix easily. Are you going to get divorced? Lucas asked, his voice trembling. Jim took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. Yes, Lucas, we are. But that doesn't mean we love you and Grace any less. We are still a family, even if things are changing. Lucas nodded slowly, tears welling up in his eyes. Jim pulled him into a tight hug, wishing he could take away his son's pain. As the weeks passed, the tension between Jim and Linda slowly began to ease. They reached a tentative truce, both determined to prioritize their children's well-being. Jim moved into a small apartment nearby, making sure to spend as much time with Grace and Lucas as possible. One afternoon, as Jim was unpacking boxes in his new place, his phone rang. It was David. Hey, Jim, how are you holding up? David asked. I am managing, Jim replied, just trying to take things one day at a time. Listen, a bunch of us are getting together this weekend for a barbecue. Thought it might be good for you to get out and see some friendly faces, David said. Jim hesitated for a moment, then smiled. That sounds great. I could use a break. As the weekend approached, Jim found himself looking forward to the gathering. It would be a chance to relax, catch up with friends, and momentarily forget about the turmoil in his personal life. The barbecue was held at Jordan Air Park, a spacious area with picnic tables, a playground, and plenty of open space for games. Jim arrived early, helping David set up the grill and arrange the food. As more people arrived, Jim felt a sense of normalcy returning. He laughed and chatted with old friends, enjoying the camaraderie. It was a welcome distraction from the stress and heartache that had consumed his life. Later in the afternoon, as the sun began to set, Jim found himself sitting with David, watching the kids play on the playground. Thanks for this, David, Jim said. I needed it. David smiled, clapping him on the shoulder. Anytime, Jim. We are all here for you. As the evening drew to a close, Jim felt a renewed sense of hope. It wouldn't be easy, but he knew he had the support of his friends and the strength to rebuild his life. Chapter 4. Rebuilding the Future. Jim Collins sat in his new apartment, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the sparse furnishings. It had been a challenging few months, but he was finally beginning to feel a sense of stability. The kids were adjusting, and his job at Curtis Construction kept him busy. Still, there was an emptiness that lingered, a void that couldn't be filled by work or routine. That evening, Jim decided to take a walk. He strolled through the neighborhood, his thoughts drifting back to his family. As he walked past the local park, he noticed a small group of people gathered around a community notice board. Curious, he approached and saw a flyer advertising a community cleanup day. The event was scheduled for the coming Saturday, and volunteers were needed. Feeling the need to be part of something and keep his mind occupied, Jim signed up. The following Saturday, he arrived at the park early, ready to help. There were already a few people there, organizing supplies and assigning tasks. As he approached the group, a woman with bright eyes and a warm smile greeted him. "Hi, I am Emma Davis," she said, extending her hand. "Thanks for volunteering. Nice to meet you, Emma." "I am Jim Collins," he replied, shaking her hand. "Happy to help out." Emma handed him a pair of gloves and a trash bag. "We are starting with the playground area. It's in pretty rough shape." Jim nodded and got to work. As they picked up litter and cleared debris, he and Emma chatted about their lives. He learned that she was a teacher at the local elementary school and had moved to Maplewood a few years ago. "I love it here," Emma said, wiping sweat from her brow. "The community is so welcoming." "It's a good place," Jim agreed. "I've lived here most of my life. It's nice to see people coming together like this." As the day went on, Jim found himself enjoying Emma's company. She was kind and thoughtful, with a quick wit that made him laugh. By the time the cleanup was finished, they had formed an easy camaraderie. "Thanks for all your help today, Jim," Emma said as they gathered the last of the trash bags. "We really made a difference." "It was my pleasure," Jim replied. "Maybe we could grab a coffee sometime? I'd love to hear more about your work." Emma smiled, a hint of a blush coloring her cheeks. "I'd like that. How about tomorrow?" "Sounds good," Jim said, feeling a flutter of anticipation. The next day, they met at a cozy cafe in the heart of Maplewood. Over steaming mugs of coffee, they talked about their lives, their dreams, and the challenges they had faced. Emma shared stories about her students, and Jim found himself opening up about his recent struggles. "It's been tough," he admitted, "but I'm trying to move forward. I want to be the best dad I can be for Grace and Lucas." "They were lucky to have you," Emma said softly. "It is clear how much you love them." Jim smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. There was something about Emma that put him at ease, made him feel hopeful. Over the next few weeks, Jim and Emma spent more time together. They went for walks, shared meals, and discovered a mutual love for classic movies. Their friendship grew, slowly blossoming into something more. One evening, as they watched a film at Jim's apartment, Emma turned to him, her expression serious. "Jim, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "What is it?" Jim asked, concern etching his features. "I've been hesitant to share this, but I feel like you should know," Emma began, taking a deep breath. "I have a health condition. It's not serious, but it is something I deal with every day." Jim reached out, taking her hand in his. "You can tell me anything, Emma. I am here for you." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I have diabetes. It is manageable, but it affects my life in ways most people don't see." Jim squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you for telling me. I'm here for you, no matter what." Emma smiled through her tears. "I just didn't want you to think I was keeping secrets." Jim leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "We all have things we deal with, Emma. What matters is that we are honest with each other." Their relationship continued to deepen, built on trust and mutual support. Emma's health condition brought them closer, as Jim learned to be attentive to her needs, and she opened up about her experiences. As they grew closer, Jim introduced Emma to Grace and Lucas. They met at the park for a casual picnic, and Jim watched nervously as his kids interacted with Emma. To his relief, they hit it off immediately. Emma's warmth and kindness won them over, and soon they were laughing and playing together. "Dad, Emma's really nice," Grace said later that day, her eyes shining with excitement. "I like her too," Lucas added. "She fun." Jim smiled, feeling a sense of peace. His children's approval meant the world to him, and their acceptance of Emma was a significant step forward. As the months passed, Jim and Emma S. bond grew stronger. They faced challenges together, from navigating the complexities of blended family dynamics to managing Emma S. health. Through it all, their love and commitment to each other never wavered. One evening, as they sat on the porch of Jim S.'s apartment, watching the sunset, Emma turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Jim, I've been thinking," she began. "About us, about the future." Jim looked at her, his heart pounding. "What about it?" "I love you," Emma said simply. "And I love Grace and Lucas. I want to build a life with you, all of us together." Jim felt a rush of emotion. "I love you too, Emma. I want that more than anything." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their words sinking in. It was a big step, but one they were ready to take together. As they planned their future, Jim felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had faced the darkest days of his life and come out stronger. With Emma by his side, he knew he could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The next few months were filled with preparations and excitement. Jim and Emma found a house that could accommodate their growing family, and they spent weekends painting and fixing it up. Grace and Lucas were thrilled, helping to choose colors for their new rooms and planning a garden in the backyard. Finally, the day came when they moved into their new home. It was a fresh start, a new beginning for all of them. Jim looked around the cozy living room, filled with boxes and the promise of countless memories to come. He felt a profound sense of gratitude and hope. As they settled in, Jim knew that life would always have its challenges, but he was ready to face them. With Emma, Grace, and Lucas by his side, he had everything he needed. Chapter 5. Under Siege. Jim Collins stood in the middle of the bustling construction site, barking orders at his crew. The project, a new office building in downtown Maplewood, was one of the biggest jobs Curtis Construction had landed in years. It was also a chance for Jim to prove himself, to show that he could move forward despite the turmoil in his personal life. "Let's get those beams up!" Jim shouted over the noise of machinery. "We are on a tight schedule, people!" David Adams, the site manager and Jim S. boss, approached him with a concerned look. "Jim, we've got a problem," he said, handing Jim a clipboard. "The supplier says they can deliver the steel beams until next week." Jim frowned, scanning the paperwork. "We can't afford any delays, David. We need those beams now." David sighed. "I know, but it seems someone's been spreading rumors about us. Suppliers are getting skittish." Jim's jaw tightened. "Let me guess, Mark Lavalier." David nodded. "It wouldn't surprise me. He's been underbidding us on other projects, trying to undermine us." Jim clenched his fists, feeling a surge of anger. Mark's sabotage attempts were becoming more than just a professional nuisance. They were personal. "I'll make some calls. We'll get this sorted." As Jim worked to secure another supplier, the days grew longer and more stressful. Mark's interference seemed to be everywhere, from late deliveries to mysterious accidents on the site. One afternoon, as Jim was inspecting the new framework, he heard a loud crash behind him. Spinning around, he saw a section of scaffolding collapse, sending workers scrambling for safety. "Everyone, clear the area!" Jim shouted, rushing to help. David ran over, his face pale. "What the hell happened?" Jim examined the fallen scaffolding, noting the frayed ropes and loose bolts. "This wasn't an accident," he said grimly. "Someone tampered with it." David swore under his breath. "We need to tighten security. I'll get someone to check the cameras." As the site was cleared and the damage assessed, Jim's frustration grew. Mark was playing dirty, and it was time to confront him. That evening, Jim drove to Mark's office, his mind racing with anger and determination. He stormed into the building, ignoring the receptionist's protests, and found Mark in his office, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin. "Well, if it isn't Jim Collins," Mark said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "What brings you here?" Jim closed the door behind him, his eyes narrowing. "Cut the crap, Mark. I know what you're doing." Mark's grin widened. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Jim slammed his fist on the desk, causing Mark to flinch. "Don't play games with me. You've been sabotaging our projects, spreading rumors, and trying to ruin my reputation." Mark leaned forward, his expression cold. Business is business, Jim. If you can handle the competition, maybe you're in the wrong field. Jim's temper flared, but he forced himself to stay calm. This isn't just about business, Mark. You've crossed the line. Mark stood up, his face inches from Jim's. And what are you going to do about it? Jim met his gaze, unflinching. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you've been up to. You want to get away with this. Mark laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the office. Good luck with that, Jim. You are out of your league. Jim turned and walked out, his resolve hardening. He would find a way to stop Mark, no matter what it took. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Jim worked tirelessly to secure new suppliers, increase security, and keep the project on track. His crew rallied behind him, their loyalty and determination matching his own. One evening, as he was reviewing the day's progress, his phone rang. It was Emma. Hey, Jim, how's everything going? She asked, her voice warm and comforting. Rough, Jim admitted. Mark's making things difficult, but we are managing. I'm sorry you're dealing with this, Emma said softly. I wish I could do more to help. Just hearing your voice helps, Jim said, feeling a wave of gratitude. How are you and the kids? We are good. Grace has a school project she's excited about, and Lucas wants to show you his new bike tricks, Emma said with a laugh. Jim smiled, the tension easing slightly. I can wait to see them. Thanks for checking in, Emma. It means a lot. Anytime, Jim. We'll get through this together. As the days turned into weeks, the project slowly began to recover. The new supplier delivered the steel beams, and the crew worked overtime to make up for lost time. Jim kept a close eye on everything, determined not to let Mark's sabotage derail them. One afternoon, as he was overseeing the installation of the beams, David approached him with a worried expression. Jim, we've got another problem, David said, handing him a piece of paper. One of our subcontractors pulled out. They cited safety concerns. Jim read the note, his frustration boiling over. This is getting ridiculous. We need to find a replacement fast. David nodded. I'll start making calls. We'll find someone. As they scrambled to secure a new subcontractor, Jim's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Alyssa Thompson. Jim, we need to talk. Urgent. Call me when you can. Jim's heart sank. He found a quiet corner and called Alyssa. Jim, I've been digging into Mark's activities, Alyssa said without preamble. It's worse than we thought. He's been bribing suppliers and subcontractors to pull out of your projects. Jim clenched his jaw. What can we do? We need evidence, Alyssa replied. I am working on it, but it's going to take time. In the meantime, keep everything documented. We'll build a case. Thanks, Alyssa, Jim said. I appreciate your help. Hang in there, Jim. We'll get him, Alyssa said before hanging up. Jim returned to the site, his resolve stronger than ever. He briefed David on the situation, and they doubled their efforts to secure trustworthy subcontractors. The crew worked tirelessly, their dedication shining through despite the setbacks. One evening, as Jim was locking up the site, he noticed a figure lurking in the shadows. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding. The figure turned, revealing a familiar face. Ray? Jim said, recognizing one of Mark's former employees. What are you doing here? Ray looked around nervously. I needed to talk to you, Jim. It's about Mark. He's been up to some shady stuff. Jim's pulse quickened. Go on. I quit working for him when I found out what he was doing, Ray said, glancing over his shoulder. He's been paying people off, sabotaging your projects, anything to get ahead. Jim nodded, feeling a surge of hope. Can you help us prove it? Ray hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I've got some documents and emails. It's risky, but I can get them to you. Thank you, Ray, Jim said sincerely. This could make a huge difference. As Ray handed over a USB drive, Jim felt a glimmer of victory. They were finally getting the evidence they needed. Over the next few days, Jim and Alyssa worked tirelessly to compile the evidence. Ray's documents were a goldmine, detailing payments, emails, and contracts that implicated Mark in a wide range of unethical activities. With Alyssa's help, they filed a formal complaint and prepared for a legal battle. The news of the complaint spread quickly, causing a stir in the construction community. Suppliers and subcontractors who had been hesitant to work with Jim began to reconsider, offering their support. One afternoon, as Jim was working on the site, he received a call from Mark. Jim, we need to talk. Mark said, his tone surprisingly subdued. About what? Jim asked, his guard up. Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th Street. Tonight at 8, Mark said before hanging up. Jim's mind raced with possibilities. He decided to go, but not without backup. He called David and filled him in on the plan. I'll be there, David said. Be careful, Jim. That evening, Jim arrived at the warehouse, his heart pounding. David was parked a block away, ready to intervene if things went south. Jim stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. Mark was waiting, his expression tense. Thanks for coming, Jim. Get to the point, Mark, Jim said, keeping his distance. Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. I am in deep trouble, Jim. The complaint you filed, it's going to ruin me. Jim felt a pang of satisfaction, but kept his voice steady. You brought this on yourself, Mark. You sabotaged my projects, put my crew in danger. I know, Mark said, his voice cracking. I was desperate, my business was failing, and I thought I could take you down to save myself. Jim shook his head. That's no excuse. Mark looked up, desperation in his eyes. Can we work something out? I'll back off, stop the sabotage, just withdraw the complaint. Jim crossed his arms, considering his options. You hurt a lot of people, Mark. This isn't just about business anymore. Mark's shoulders slumped. I know. I'm sorry, Jim. I really am. Jim studied him for a moment, then nodded. Here's the deal. You stop all sabotage, cooperate with the investigation, and make restitution to everyone you've hurt. Maybe then we can talk about withdrawing the complaint. Mark nodded, relief flooding his face. I'll do it. Thank you, Jim. As Jim left the warehouse, he felt a sense of closure. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time he felt like they were making progress. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Mark kept his word, stopping all sabotage and cooperating with the investigation. Suppliers and subcontractors began to trust Jim's projects again, and the office building started to take shape. One afternoon, as Jim was reviewing the day's progress, David approached him with a grin. Jim, we did it. The Project S back on track. Jim smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. We couldn't have done it without everyone's hard work. Thank you, David. David clapped him on the shoulder. You're a good man, Jim. We all believe in you. As the sun set over the construction site, Jim felt a renewed sense of hope. They had faced challenges and overcome them, and he knew that with determination and the support of his friends and family, they could face whatever came next. Chapter 6. Beneath the Surface. Jim Collins sat at his kitchen table, the early morning light casting long shadows through the room. The coffee in his mug had gone cold, untouched as he stared at the documents spread out before him. Alyssa Thompson had sent over the latest updates on the case against Mark Lavalier, and the pile of evidence was growing steadily. Emma Davis walked in, her hair tousled from sleep. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from Jim. Morning, she said softly, her eyes filled with concern. You didn't come to bed last night. Jim sighed, rubbing his temples. I couldn't sleep. There's so much going on with this case, and I am worried about how it is affecting the kids. Emma reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. We'll get through this, Jim. You're doing everything you can. Jim managed a small smile. Thanks, Emma. I don't know what I'd do without you. They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, the weight of the situation hanging over them. Finally, Jim stood up, gathering the documents into a neat stack. I should get to the site. We've got a lot to do today. Emma nodded, standing to give him a hug. Be careful, okay? I will, Jim promised, kissing her gently. I'll see you tonight. As Jim drove to the construction site, his mind was a whirl of thoughts. The legal battle with Mark was draining, but it was necessary. He couldn't let Mark get away with everything he had done. Jim had worked too hard to build his reputation, and he wasn't about to let anyone tear it down. At the site, the crew was already hard at work. David Adams greeted him with a nod. Morning, Jim. How's it going? Jim shrugged, setting down his bag, same as always. We've got a lot to do, but we're making progress. David clapped him on the shoulder. We are with you, Jim. We'll get through this. As they worked, Jim couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. He had learned to trust his instincts, and they were rarely wrong. That afternoon, his phone buzzed with a message from Alyssa. "Jim, we need to meet. I've found something important." Jim's heart skipped a beat. He quickly replied, setting up a meeting for later that evening. The rest of the day passed in a blur, his mind focused on what Alyssa might have discovered. That evening, Jim met Alyssa at her office. She greeted him with a serious expression, motioning for him to sit down. "What's going on, Alyssa?" Jim asked, his voice tense. Alyssa handed him a file, her eyes grave. "I've been digging into Mark's finances. It is worse than we thought. He's been laundering money through his construction projects, and it's linked to some pretty shady characters." Jim's eyes widened as he flipped through the file. "This is unbelievable." Alyssa nodded. "I've already notified the authorities. They're launching an investigation, but we need to be careful. Mark's connections could be dangerous." Jim took a deep breath, processing the information. "What do we do now?" "We keep gathering evidence and stay vigilant," Alyssa said. "This isn't just about business anymore. It's about bringing Mark to justice." Jim felt a surge of determination. "We'll do whatever it takes." As he drove home, Jim's mind raced with possibilities. The stakes had just gotten higher, and he knew they were in for a fight. He shared the news with Emma that night, her expression mirroring his concern. "We'll be careful," Jim reassured her, "but we can't back down now." Emma hugged him tightly. "I know. Just promise me you will stay safe." "I promise," Jim said, holding her close. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The investigation into Mark's activities intensified, with authorities digging deeper into his finances and business dealings. Jim and his crew kept their heads down, focusing on the construction project while staying vigilant for any signs of trouble. One afternoon, as Jim was reviewing blueprints in his office, his phone rang. It was Ray, the former employee of Mark who had provided crucial evidence. "Jim, I've got more information for you," Ray said, his voice urgent. "Meet me at the diner on Main Street, tonight at 7. Jim agreed, feeling a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. That evening, he arrived at the diner, spotting Ray in a corner booth. He slid into the seat opposite him, noting the tension in Ray's expression. "What's going on, Ray?" Jim asked. Ray glanced around nervously before leaning in. "I found out something big. Mark has been using shell companies to funnel money. He's connected to some dangerous people, Jim. This goes deeper than we thought." Jim felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" Ray handed him a folder. "These are documents linking Mark to a criminal organization. If this gets out, it'll blow the case wide open." Jim took the folder, his mind racing. "Thank you, Ray. This could make all the difference." Ray nodded, his expression serious. "Just be careful, Jim. These people don't play around." As Jim drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The situation was escalating, and he knew they were walking a fine line. He shared the new information with Alyssa, who immediately began coordinating with the authorities. The days that followed were tense. Jim kept a close eye on the construction site, making sure everything was running smoothly. One evening, as he was locking up, he noticed a car parked down the street. It was the same car he had seen a few times over the past week. His instincts on high alert, Jim walked over to the car, his heart pounding. The driver rolled down the window, revealing a man with a hard expression. "Can I help you?" Jim asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man smirked. "Just keeping an eye on things. Wouldn't want anything to happen to your nice little project here." Jim's jaw tightened. "Who are you?" "Just a concerned party," the man said, his tone mocking. "Have a good night, Jim." As the car drove away, Jim felt a knot of fear tighten in his stomach. He knew they were being watched and the stakes were higher than ever. He called David and filled him in, their conversation tense. "We need to be careful," David said, "but we cannot let them intimidate us." "I know," Jim replied. "We'll keep pushing forward." The following days were a blur of activity. Jim and his crew worked tirelessly, keeping their focus on the project while staying alert for any signs of trouble. The authorities continued their investigation, gathering more evidence against Mark and his associates. One evening, as Jim was heading home, His phone buzzed with a message from Alyssa. "Jim, we've got them. Arrests are being made tonight." Jim felt a surge of relief. He quickly called Emma, sharing the news. "That's amazing, Jim," Emma said, her voice filled with excitement. "You did it. We did it," Jim corrected, feeling a sense of pride and gratitude. "I couldn't have done this without you and everyone's support." That night, Jim watched the news as reports of the arrests flashed across the screen. Mark and several of his associates had been taken into custody, their operations dismantled. The sense of justice was overwhelming, a victory hard-earned. The next day, Jim arrived at the construction site to find his crew in high spirits. David greeted him with a wide grin. "We did it, Jim. The project is back on track and Mark S. out of the picture." Jim smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "Thanks, David. This wouldn't have been possible without everyone's hard work." As they worked, Jim felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had faced immense challenges and come out stronger. With the project nearing completion, he knew they were on the brink of something great. That evening, as Jim returned home, he found Emma and the kids waiting for him. They had set up a small celebration, complete with balloons and a homemade banner that read, "Congratulations, Dad." Jim felt a surge of emotion as he hugged them. "Thank you," he said, his voice choked with gratitude. "I couldn't have done this without you." Emma smiled, tears in her eyes. "We are so proud of you, Jim." As they celebrated, Jim felt a sense of peace. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but with his family and friends by his side, he knew they could face anything. Chapter 7. New Beginnings. The dawn of a new day bathed Maplewood in a warm, golden light. Jim Collins stood on the porch of his new home, taking a deep breath and savoring the crisp morning air. The house was a symbol of his fresh start, a testament to the resilience and determination that had carried him through the toughest of times. Inside, the sound of laughter echoed through the rooms. Grace and Lucas were chasing each other around the living room, their playful shouts filling the house with life. Emma Davis emerged from the kitchen, a tray of pancakes and fresh fruit in her hands. "Breakfast is ready," she called, her eyes sparkling with happiness. Jim smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. This was what he had fought for, the chance to build a new life with the people he loved. He joined them at the table, the smell of pancakes and syrup making his mouth water. As they ate, Jim couldn't help but feel a profound sense of gratitude. They had faced countless challenges, but they had come through stronger and closer than ever. After breakfast, Jim and Emma decided to take the kids to the park. It was a beautiful day, and the park was bustling with families enjoying the sunshine. Grace and Lucas ran off to play on the swings, while Jim and Emma found a bench where they could sit and watch. "I love seeing them so happy," Emma said, leaning her head on Jim's shoulder. "Me too," Jim replied, wrapping his arm around her. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Emma nodded, a soft smile on her lips. "We have, and I wouldn't trade it for anything." As they watched the children play, Jim felt a sense of peace settle over him. They were building something beautiful together, one day at a time. The weeks that followed were filled with moments of joy and discovery. Jim and Emma worked tirelessly to make their new house a home, painting walls, planting a garden, and adding personal touches that made it uniquely theirs. Grace and Lucas adjusted well to their new surroundings, making friends and settling into their routines. One evening, as they sat on the porch enjoying the cool breeze, Emma turned to Jim with a thoughtful expression. "Jim, there's something I have been thinking about." Jim looked at her, curious. "What is it?" "I have been thinking about our future," Emma said, her voice soft. "I want us to get married." Jim's heart skipped a beat. He had thought about proposing to Emma many times, but hadn't found the right moment. Now, hearing her say it filled him with a rush of emotion. "Emma, I've been wanting to ask you the same thing," Jim said, his voice filled with love. "I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Emma's eyes sparkled with tears. "I love you too, Jim. Yes, let us get married." They embraced, the world around them fading away as they shared a kiss filled with promise and hope. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparations and excitement. They decided on a small, intimate ceremony at a beautiful garden in Maplewood. Friends and family rallied around them, helping with the arrangements and sharing in their joy. On the day of the wedding, the garden was transformed into a magical setting. Flowers bloomed in vibrant colors, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of roses and lilies. Jim stood at the altar, his heart pounding with anticipation as he watched Emma walk down the aisle. She looked radiant, her smile lighting up the entire garden. Grace and Lucas walked beside her, their faces beaming with happiness. As Emma reached the altar, Jim took her hands in his, feeling the weight of the moment. The ceremony was beautiful, filled with heartfelt vows and the love of those gathered to witness their union. As they exchanged rings and shared their first kiss as husband and wife, Jim felt a sense of completeness he had never known before. The reception was a joyful celebration, filled with laughter, dancing, and the warmth of family and friends. Jim and Emma danced under the stars, their hearts light with happiness. As the night drew to a close, Jim and Emma found a quiet corner where they could reflect on the day. "This has been the best day of my life," Jim said, holding Emma close. "Mine too," Emma replied, her eyes shining with love. "I can't wait to see what the future holds for us." They shared a tender kiss, the promise of their new life together stretching out before them. The days that followed were filled with the rhythm of everyday life, each moment a step forward in their journey together. Jim and Emma faced challenges and joys, their love growing stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, as they were working in the garden, Jim noticed Emma wince and place a hand on her stomach. "Are you okay?" he asked, concern etching his features. Emma nodded, though her face was pale. "I think I need to sit down for a moment." Jim helped her to a nearby bench, his heart pounding with worry. "Should we go to the doctor?" "I think so," Emma said, her voice trembling slightly, "just to be safe." They went to the doctor the next day, the waiting room filled with a tense silence. After a thorough examination, the doctor smiled reassuringly. "Everything looks good," he said, "but I do have some news for you." Jim and Emma exchanged nervous glances. "What is it?" Jim asked. "Congratulations," the doctor said with a smile. "You're expecting." Emma's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. "I am pregnant?" The doctor nodded. "Yes, about 8 weeks along. It's early, but everything looks healthy." Jim felt a rush of emotions, joy, excitement, and a hint of fear. They had talked about having children, but the news was still a surprise. As they left the doctor's office, Emma turned to Jim, her eyes filled with tears of happiness. "We're going to have a baby." Jim hugged her tightly, feeling a sense of awe and wonder. "I can't believe it. This is amazing." The news of Emma's pregnancy brought a new layer of excitement to their lives. Grace and Lucas were thrilled at the prospect of having a new sibling, and the entire family rallied around Emma, offering their support and love. The months passed in a blur of preparations and anticipation. Jim and Emma decorated the nursery, attended doctor's appointments, and shared in the joy of expecting a new addition to their family. One evening, as they sat in the nursery, Jim felt a wave of emotion wash over him. "I can't believe how far we've come," he said softly. Emma smiled, placing a hand on her growing belly. "We've been through a lot, but it's all been worth it." Jim took her hand, his heart filled with love. "I am so grateful for you, Emma, for everything." They shared a tender kiss, the promise of their future shining brightly. As the due date approached, the excitement and anticipation grew. Jim took time off work, wanting to be there for every moment. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, Emma's face suddenly contorted in pain. "Jim," she said, her voice strained, "I think it's time." Jim's heart raced as he helped Emma to the car, his mind focused on getting her to the hospital. The drive felt like an eternity, but they arrived safely, the hospital staff quickly taking Emma into the delivery room. The hours that followed were a blur of activity and emotion. Jim held Emma's hand, offering words of encouragement and love as she brought their child into the world. Finally, the sound of a baby's cry filled the room, and Jim felt tears of joy streaming down his face. The doctor placed a tiny, wriggling baby in Emma's arms, and she looked up at Jim with a radiant smile. "Meet our daughter," Emma said softly, her eyes filled with love. Jim gazed at the tiny, perfect face of his daughter, feeling a love so profound it took his breath away. "She's as beautiful," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. As they held their new baby, Jim felt a sense of completeness he had never known before. Their journey had been filled with challenges, but it had led them to this moment, a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. They named their daughter Audrey, a name that symbolized strength and grace. As they brought her home, Grace and Lucas welcomed her with open arms, their family now complete. The days that followed were filled with sleepless nights and joyful moments. Jim and Emma navigated the challenges of parenthood together, their love and partnership growing stronger with each passing day. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jim looked at Emma, his heart overflowing with gratitude. "Thank you for this life we've built together," he said softly. Emma smiled, her eyes shining with love. "I couldn't imagine it any other way." As they watched the sun dip below the horizon, Jim felt a sense of peace. They had faced countless challenges and come out stronger. With Emma, Grace, Lucas, and now Audrey by his side, he knew that they could face anything the future held. Chapter 8. Final Showdown. The autumn leaves crunched under Jim Collins' boots as he walked through the park, his mind heavy with the weight of recent events. The investigation into Mark Lavalier had uncovered more than anyone had anticipated, leading to a web of corruption and deceit that stretched far beyond the confines of Maplewood. Jim had been working closely with Alyssa Thompson, providing testimony and evidence to support the case against Mark and his associates. Despite the progress, the constant pressure and threats had taken their toll. Jim's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Alyssa. "Jim, we've got a problem," Alyssa said, her voice tense. "Mark's been released on bail. He's already making moves to undermine our case." Jim felt a surge of frustration. "What do we do now?" "Stay vigilant," Alyssa replied. "We've come too far to let him get away with this. But be careful. He is desperate, and desperate men do dangerous things." "I will," Jim said, his resolve hardening. "Thanks for the heads up, Alyssa." As he hung up, Jim's thoughts turned to his family. Emma, Grace, Lucas, and little Audrey were his world, and he would do anything to protect them. He knew he had to remain strong, no matter what Mark threw their way. That evening, as Jim arrived home, he was greeted by the warm, comforting sight of his family. Emma was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, while Grace and Lucas played with Audrey in the living room. The sound of their laughter filled the house, momentarily easing the tension in Jim's chest. Emma looked up as he entered, a concerned expression on her face. "Everything okay?" Jim nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just a long day. How are you feeling?" "Better now that you are home," Emma said, her smile warm and reassuring. They sat down to dinner, the conversation flowing easily. Jim found solace in these moments, the simple joys of family life grounding him amidst the chaos. But as the evening wore on, his thoughts kept drifting back to Mark and the looming threat he posed. Later that night, after the kids were tucked into bed, Jim sat with Emma on the porch, the cool night air a welcome relief. "Emma, there is something I need to tell you," Jim began, his voice serious. Emma looked at him, her eyes filled with concern. "What is it?" "Mark's out on bail," Jim said, his jaw tightening. "Alyssa thinks he might try to undermine the case." Emma's eyes widened. "What does that mean for us?" "It means we need to be careful," Jim said, taking her hand. "I wouldn't let anything happen to you or the kids, but we have to stay vigilant." Emma nodded, her grip tightening on his hand. "We'll get through this, Jim. Together." The days that followed were filled with a tense vigilance. Jim kept a close eye on everything, ensuring the safety of his family while continuing to work on the construction site. The project was nearing completion, a beacon of hope amidst the turmoil. One afternoon, as Jim was overseeing the final stages of construction, he received an urgent call from David Adams. "Jim, you need to get to the site office now," David said, his voice strained. "We've got a situation." Jim's heart raced as he rushed to the office. He found David standing with two police officers, their expressions grim. "What's going on?" Jim asked, his voice edged with worry. "We received a tip-off about a potential threat to the site," one of the officers explained. "We are here to ensure everything is secure." Jim felt a cold knot of fear in his stomach. "Do you know who's behind this?" The officer nodded. "We believe it's connected to the ongoing investigation. We are taking every precaution." As the officers conducted their inspection, Jim's thoughts turned to his family. He needed to make sure they were safe. He called Emma, his voice urgent. "Emma, there's been a potential threat at the site," Jim said. "I need you to take the kids and stay with David and Sarah for a while." Emma's voice was calm but determined. "We'll go right away. Be careful, Jim." "I will," Jim promised. "I'll call you as soon as I know more." With his family safely out of harm's way, Jim focused on securing the construction site. The police conducted a thorough sweep, finding nothing suspicious. Despite the all-clear, the tension lingered, a constant reminder of the threat hanging over them. That evening, Jim returned to an empty home, the silence a stark contrast to the usual bustle of family life. He checked his phone, finding a message from Emma letting him know they were safe with David and Sarah. As he settled into bed, Jim's thoughts turned to Mark. He knew this wasn't over. Mark was desperate and dangerous, and Jim had to be ready for anything. The next few days were a blur of work and vigilance. Jim kept a close watch on the site, ensuring everything was running smoothly while staying alert for any signs of trouble. The authorities continued their investigation, gathering more evidence to strengthen the case against Mark and his associates. One evening, as Jim was locking up the site, he noticed a figure lurking in the shadows. His instincts on high alert, he approached cautiously, recognizing the familiar silhouette of Ray. "Ray, what are you doing here?" Jim asked, his voice low. Ray glanced around nervously. "I've got more information for you. Mark is planning something big. He's desperate, Jim. You need to be ready." Jim felt a surge of adrenaline. "What is he planning?" "I don't know the details, but he's been meeting with some dangerous people," Ray said. "He has got nothing to lose, and that makes him even more dangerous." Jim nodded, his mind racing. "Thanks for the heads up, Ray. I'll take care of it." As Ray slipped away into the night, Jim's resolve hardened. He needed to be proactive, to protect his family and ensure Mark was brought to justice. The following day, Jim met with Alyssa and the authorities, sharing Ray's information. The investigation intensified with a renewed focus on uncovering Mark's plans. One afternoon, as Jim was working on the site, he received a call from David. "Jim, you need to get to the hospital," David said, his voice strained. "Emma's been hurt." Jim's heart plummeted. He rushed to the hospital, his mind racing with fear and worry. He found Emma in a hospital bed, her face pale and bruised. "What happened?" Jim asked, his voice choked with emotion. Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with pain. "I was at the grocery store. Someone attacked me. I think it was a warning." Jim's blood ran cold. "I am so sorry, Emma. This is my fault." Emma shook her head. "No, Jim. This isn't your fault. We knew Mark was dangerous. We just need to stay strong." Jim took her hand, his resolve solidifying. "We will. I won't let him hurt you again." As Emma recovered, Jim's focus sharpened. He coordinated with Alyssa and the authorities, providing them with every piece of information he had. The pressure on Mark increased, and the net around him tightened. One evening, as Jim was reviewing the latest updates with Alyssa, his phone buzzed with a message from Ray. "Meet me at the warehouse on 5th Street, 9 p.m. Urgent." Jim felt a surge of unease. He knew this could be a trap, but it could also be the key to finally stopping Mark. He shared the message with Alyssa and the authorities, ensuring they had backup ready. That night, Jim arrived at the warehouse, his heart pounding. The darkness seemed to close in around him as he stepped inside, his senses on high alert. Ray emerged from the shadows, his face etched with fear. "Jim, you need to see this," he said, handing over a file. "It is everything. Proof of Mark's dealings, his plans, it is all here." Jim took the file, his mind racing. "Thank you, Ray. This could change everything." As they spoke, a noise echoed through the warehouse. Jim's instincts flared and he turned to see Mark and two of his associates entering the building. "Well, well, well," Mark said, his voice dripping with malice. "Looks like we've got a little reunion." Jim's jaw tightened. "It's over, Mark. We have everything we need to bring you down." Mark laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You think this is over? You have no idea what you are dealing with." Before Jim could react, Mark's associates lunged forward. Jim fought back, his training and instincts kicking in. The struggle was intense, the sound of fists and grunts echoing through the warehouse. In the chaos, Ray managed to slip away, disappearing into the shadows. Jim fought with everything he had, determination fueling his every move. As the fight raged on, he managed to disarm one of Mark's associates, turning the weapon on them. "Stop!" Jim shouted, his voice echoing through the warehouse. "It is over, Mark! Surrender now!" Mark hesitated, his eyes filled with desperation. He glanced around, realizing the odds were against him. With a snarl, he dropped his weapon, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The authorities burst into the warehouse, their presence a welcome relief. They quickly apprehended Mark and his associates, securing the area. Jim stood there, his heart pounding, the weight of the moment settling over him. Alyssa approached, her expression one of relief and admiration. "You did it, Jim," she said. "It's over." Jim nodded, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. We did it. Together. As the authorities led Mark away, Jim felt a sense of closure. The fight had been long and hard, but justice had prevailed. That night, Jim returned home, finding Emma waiting for him. She embraced him tightly, tears of relief in her eyes. "It's over," Jim said softly. "We are safe." Emma nodded, her grip tightening. "I am so proud of you, Jim. You are our hero." As they held each other, Jim felt a profound sense of peace. They had faced the darkest of times and come out stronger. With his family by his side, he knew they could face anything the future held. Chapter 9. Echoes of the Heart. The sun rose gently over Maplewood, casting a golden glow across the town. For Jim Collins, it felt like a new dawn in more ways than one. The ordeal with Mark Lavalier was finally over, and life was beginning to settle into a peaceful rhythm. The sense of relief was palpable, and for the first time in months, Jim felt he could breathe freely. Jim stood on the porch of his home, sipping his morning coffee and watching as Grace and Lucas played with their new baby sister, Audrey, in the yard. Emma Davis joined him, her presence a comforting balm to his soul. They exchanged a smile, the unspoken understanding between them deepening with each passing day. "Looks like we've got our lives back," Emma said softly, slipping her hand into Jim's. Jim nodded, squeezing her hand. "We've been through a lot, but it has made us stronger. I couldn't have done this without you." Emma's eyes sparkled with emotion, and I couldn't have asked for a better partner. As the days turned into weeks, the Collins family settled into a routine that was both comforting and fulfilling. Jim continued his work at Curtis Construction, the office building project nearing its grand opening. The sense of accomplishment was immense, a testament to the hard work and dedication of the entire team. One afternoon, as Jim was reviewing the final touches on the project, David Adams approached him with a broad smile. "Jim, I have got some great news," David said, clapping him on the shoulder. "The company wants to promote you to project manager. You've proven yourself time and again, and they believe you are the right person for the job." Jim felt a surge of pride and gratitude. "Thank you, David. It is an honor. I won't let you down." David grinned. "I know you won, T. You've earned this, Jim. Enjoy it." With the promotion came new responsibilities, but Jim embraced them wholeheartedly. He found joy in his work, knowing he was building a better future for his family. At home, life was equally rewarding. Emma's pregnancy continued to progress smoothly, and Grace and Lucas were thriving in their new environment. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, Jim decided it was time to have a serious conversation with his children. "Grace, Lucas, there's something I want to talk to you about," Jim began, his tone gentle. Grace looked up from her plate, her eyes curious. "What is it, Dad?" Jim took a deep breath. You know how much I love Emma, right? And how much she means to all of us? Both children nodded, their expressions attentive. Well, I've been thinking, and I want to ask Emma to officially join our family. I want to marry her, Jim said, watching their reactions closely. Grace's face lit up with excitement. Really? That is amazing, Dad. I love Emma. She's the best. Lucas grinned, his eyes shining. Yeah, Emma is awesome. This is great news. Jim felt a wave of relief and joy wash over him. I'm glad you both feel that way. I wanted to make sure you were okay with it before I asked her. The next morning, Jim decided to take Emma on a special outing. They drove to a beautiful spot by the lake, a place that held many cherished memories for them. As they walked along the shoreline hand in hand, Jim felt his heart swell with love. He stopped, turning to face Emma, and took her hands in his. Emma, these past months have been the most challenging and rewarding of my life. You've been my rock, my partner, and my love. I can imagine my life without you, Jim said, his voice filled with emotion. Will you marry me? Emma's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, a radiant smile spreading across her face. Yes, Jim, 1,000 times, yes. They embraced, their hearts overflowing with happiness and anticipation for the future. The wedding was a beautiful, intimate affair, held in the garden of their new home. Friends and family gathered to celebrate their love and commitment, the atmosphere filled with joy and laughter. Grace and Lucas stood proudly beside their parents, their faces beaming with happiness. As they exchanged vows, Jim felt a profound sense of peace. He had found his home, his heart, and his future in Emma. Their journey had been filled with challenges, but it had led them to this moment, a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. The months that followed were filled with the rhythms of everyday life, each moment a step forward in their journey together. Jim and Emma navigated the challenges of parenthood with grace and love, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, as Jim was working in the garden, his phone rang. It was Alyssa Thompson. Jim, I have some news, Alyssa said, her tone warm and congratulatory. The authorities have wrapped up the investigation. Mark and his associates have been sentenced and justice has been served. Jim felt a wave of relief and closure. Thank you, Alyssa. I can't express how grateful I am for everything you've done. It was a team effort, Jim. You were instrumental in bringing this case to light, Alyssa replied. I am proud of you. As Jim hung up, he felt a sense of finality. The dark chapter of Mark Lavalier was finally behind them, and the future stretched out before him like a blank canvas, ready to be painted with the colors of hope and love. That evening, Jim shared the news with Emma and the kids. They celebrated with a quiet family dinner, the atmosphere filled with gratitude and joy. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over their home, Jim and Emma sat on the porch, watching the children play in the yard. Life has a funny way of working out, doesn't it? Emma said, her voice filled with wonder. Jim nodded, his heart full. It does, and I wouldn't trade any of it for the world. As they sat there, surrounded by the love and laughter of their family, Jim felt a deep sense of peace. They had faced their darkest days and emerged stronger, their hearts filled with the echoes of love and resilience. Together they looked forward to the future, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side. Thank you for listening to this story. Subscribe to my channel, put a like under the video, and write a comment about how you like this story and what stories you want to hear.